Elara Winters returns to the orphanage of her troubled childhood, now as a teacher, to confront the haunting past hidden behind soothing lullabies. As she uncovers dark secrets of abuse masked by silence, she forms fragile bonds with the children. Especially Miranda ignites a quiet rebellion against fear. Through courage and compassion, Elara transforms the fractured lullabies of trauma into songs of healing, hope, and resilience.
Elara Winters stood before the imposing gates of the orphanage, a place etched deep in the recesses of her memory, a place where Lullabies had once woven a fragile veil over the shadows of her childhood. The iron bars, chipped and rusted with time, seemed to groan softly under the weight of years and secrets. A chill wind stirred the brittle leaves at her feet, carrying with it a faint, haunting melody that slipped through the air like a whispered ghost. She hesitated, fingers tightening around the strap of her satchel. The sky above was heavy with grey clouds, casting a muted light that dulled the once vibrant red bricks of the building. The orphanage looked smaller than she remembered, less a fortress of sanctuary and more a cage of silence. Yet, beneath the stillness, something pulsed, a stirring of memories long buried, nestled within the lullabies that had cradled her and countless others into uneasy sleep. With a deep breath, Elara pushed the gate open, its hinges protesting with a creak that echoed down the empty path. The scent of aged wood and faint antiseptic met her as she crossed the threshold, and the sound of her footsteps mingled with the soft rustling of curtains and distant murmurs. Inside, the orphanage seemed caught between past and present. The walls, once a canvas for childish drawings, now bore the dull marks of wear and neglect. The air was thick with an unsettling quiet, broken only by the faint strains of a lullaby drifting from a nearby room, a melody both tender and tinged with sorrow. It was a song she knew well, though its meaning had changed over the years. Elara's gaze swept across the dimly lit common room where a group of children sat clustered together, their faces shadowed and eyes downcast. They whispered little, their silence more telling than any words could be. The lullaby continued, sung softly by a caregiver whose voice wavered with a fragile gentleness that felt like both a balm and a barrier. Among the children, Elara's eyes settled on a small girl with pale hair and wide, watchful eyes mirror. The girl's gaze met Elara's briefly, flickering with a mixture of suspicion and something quietly hopeful. It was a look Elara recognized well. The wary trust of those who had known pain but dared not speak it aloud. As she moved through the hallways, the faded wallpaper peeled at the edges, and the wooden floorboards creaked beneath her feet. Her fingers brushed over the rough surface of the walls, tracing scars and marks that told stories of their own stories of whispered fears and silent suffering. The lullabies, once a source of comfort, now seemed fractured melodies echoing through the corridors of her mind. With every note, fragments of her own past surfaced, the secret bruises hidden beneath sleeves, the quiet sobs stifled by night, the desperate longing for a voice that could not be heard. Elara knew her return to the orphanage was more than a homecoming. It was the first step into a shadowed labyrinth of memories and truths that had long been silenced. With cautious hope mingling with the weight of sorrow, she steeled herself to face whatever lay hidden behind the lullabies for the sake of the children she had come to protect, and for the girl she once was. The sun dipped behind the clouds, casting long shadows across the orphanage's worn facade. Somewhere inside, the lullaby ended, leaving a silence that seemed to scream. And in that silence, Elara felt the stirrings of a journey that would unravel the past and challenge the very foundation of the place she called home. She stepped further inside, the gate closing softly behind her, sealing the fragile boundary between yesterday and today. The orphanage awaited, its shadows deep and full of secrets, as the first notes of a fractured lullaby began to rise once more. The afternoon light filtered through the tall windows of the orphanage, casting long, wavering shadows on the worn wooden floors. Elara Winters sat quietly in the common room, her hands folded loosely in her lap. Around her, the children gathered in small clusters, their voices rising in soft, hesitant lullabies. The melodies floated through the air, familiar and haunting, threading through the silence like fragile threads of comfort, but to Elara, they sounded fractured, hollow. She had heard these songs countless times before, but now, returning as a teacher, the lullabies carried a weight she had not understood as a child. They were no longer just soothing tunes, they were veils, concealing pain beneath their gentle cadence. Her gaze drifted over the faces of the children, some closed their eyes, lost in the music, while others stared ahead with a guarded stillness that tugged at her heart. Among them, a small girl with pale hair and wide, watchful eyes caught Elara's attention. Mira sat apart from the others, her posture tense, as though bracing against an invisible storm. There was a fragility to her presence, but also a fierce protectiveness, a silent warning not to get too close too fast. Elara's own memories stirred, fragments of her past flickering behind her eyelids, shadowed rooms, whispered threats. And the lullabies that had once cradled her to sleep, even as they masked the terror that lurked in the night. She swallowed hard, the ghost of a shiver running down her spine. The children's singing tapered off, their soft voices dissolving into uneasy silence. Elara rose, moving toward Mira with slow, deliberate steps. The girl's eyes met hers briefly before darting away, a flicker of suspicion mingled with a glimmer of hope. Elara knelt down to Mira's level, offering the gentlest of smiles. "It's good to see you," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm here to listen, whenever you're ready." Mira's lips pressed into a thin line, and she nodded, though the tension in her shoulders remained. Later, as Elara walked the dimly lit halls, she caught the wary glances of Sister Agnes from behind a doorway. The older woman's sharp features were softened by a fleeting sadness, her faded habit a quiet testament to years spent within these walls. Elara sensed a struggle beneath the stern exterior, a conflict between duty and conscience that mirrored her own. The sound of footsteps echoed sharply, and Grayson appeared, tall and imposing. His cold, unreadable face held no warmth as his eyes met Elara's. Dressed in his usual dark suit, he exuded an oppressive authority. Without a word, his presence warned her to tread carefully, to keep the past buried in silence. That evening, as the orphanage settled into a heavy quiet, Elara lingered in her room. She hummed a lullaby under her breath, the melody catching in her throat as memories surged unbidden. The song was no longer just a comfort, it was a puzzle, a key to unlocking the hidden stories of pain and resilience woven through the lives of these children. With each passing day, Elara's resolve deepened. She would listen to the silences, read the scars beneath the smiles, and follow the echoes beneath the song. The truth was there, waiting to be uncovered. But in the shadows of the orphanage, secrets resisted exposure, and the lullabies held their fragile power both to soothe and to suppress. As night fell, Elara's thoughts churned with cautious hope and a growing awareness of the delicate line she must walk. What had once been a sanctuary of song was now a labyrinth of silence and fear, and she was ready to navigate its darkest corridors. Yet, even as she prepared for the challenges ahead, a question lingered in her mind. What secrets lie beneath the lullabies that have comforted these children for so long? The answer, she knew, would change everything. The orphanage was cloaked in a suffocating hush, an eerie quiet that seemed to press against the walls, seeping into the very air Elara breathed. Though the children moved about, their steps were measured and their voices subdued, as if sound itself was a fragile thing best not wielded too freely. Elara, stepping lightly through the hallway she once knew so well, felt the weight of that silence settle around her like a shroud. Her gaze fell upon a small figure seated alone on a battered wooden bench near the window, where the afternoon light filtered weakly through grime-streaked panes. Mira sat curled into herself, her pale hair catching the dying sun's glow, her wide eyes darting cautiously as if expecting the shadows to leap forth. Elara's heart tightened. Here was a child who knew the language of silence all too well. Approaching slowly, Elara lowered herself to Mira's level, careful not to startle. "Hello," she whispered, her voice a soft thread weaving through the oppressive quiet. Mira's eyes flicked up, guarded but curious, the barest flicker of recognition passing between them. It was a fragile bridge, but a bridge nonetheless. Over the course of the day, Elara watched the children with increasing clarity. Bruises faded to mottled purple and yellow, scars both fresh and old traced across arms and necks like unreadable maps of pain. The silence was not merely absence of sound. It was a shield, a barrier to keep the horrors locked away. Yet the marks spoke volumes. In the dim corridors, Elara encountered staff members whose eyes skirted away the moment hers sought answers. Their words were clipped, polite but distant, laced with an unspoken warning. One afternoon, a terse exchange with a caretaker left Elara with the unmistakable impression that the past was a deep well best left undisturbed, a well into which many preferred to cast their secrets and forget. That night the common room lay cloaked in darkness save for a single flickering candle. Elara sat quietly, her fingers lightly tracing the worn edges of an old lullaby book she had found tucked away in a forgotten corner. She began to hum the melody softly, the notes fragile and trembling as they danced through the thick silence. It was a lullaby she remembered from her own childhood, a song once meant to soothe, now a painful reminder of what had been hidden beneath its gentle tune. The children paused from their restless pacing. Mira's eyes met Elara's, a moment of shared understanding flickering in the dim light. For a brief heartbeat, the silence was broken not by words, but by song, a delicate thread of hope woven through the darkness. Yet, beneath that fragile hope lay the heavy weight of resistance. Elara sensed the invisible walls closing in, the unseen forces determined to keep the past buried. But in Mira's cautious trust and the children's quiet longing, she found the courage to press on. The scars might be silent, but they were there, and so was the truth waiting to be unearthed. As the night deepened, Elara resolved to listen harder, to watch closer, and to reach further into the shadows. The journey would be fraught with pain and peril, but the children deserved to be heard. They deserved to be seen. And perhaps, in breaking the silence, they could begin to heal. The lullaby lingered in the air, a fractured melody echoing the fragile resilience of those who had survived in its shadow, and with it the first tentative steps toward a truth long concealed. Elara closed her eyes, the song a balm against the scars of yesterday, but also a promise for tomorrow. The silence was not yet broken, but the first cracks were there, shimmering like fragile glass waiting to shatter. And in that shattering, perhaps, lay the hope of new beginnings. The air inside the orphanage felt heavier today, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Elara Winters moved quietly down the narrow hallway, the muted patter of her footsteps swallowed by the thick silence that clung to the aged building. Every corner seemed to whisper secrets she had long tried to forget, shadows shifting just beyond the edge of her vision. She paused outside the staff room, hesitating before pushing open the door with a soft creak. The room was dim and cluttered, shelves overflowing with forgotten papers and cracked mugs, the faint scent of stale coffee mingled with dust. She settled into the worn wooden chair by the window, pulling from her bag a small bundle of notes and a ledger she had discovered earlier that day. The ledger was old, its leather cover cracked and faded, tucked away behind a loose panel in the library where few had ventured. Her fingers trembled slightly as she opened it, the pages yellowed and brittle. Names, dates, coded phrases, nothing outright, but enough to suggest something darker lurking beneath the orphanage's pristine facade. She traced the faint, looping handwriting, her mind combing through memories she had buried deep. The lullabies. They had been everywhere, once the soft, soothing songs meant to hush the children to sleep, yet in her mind now, they twisted into something more sinister. They had been a veil, a melody that masked the unspeakable. Elara swallowed the lump in her throat, blinking back the sting of tears. The silence between the notes screamed louder than any voice. A soft knock at the door startled her. She looked up to see Sister Agnes standing hesitantly in the doorway. The older woman's sharp features were drawn tight, eyes shadowed with wariness and fear. Her faded habit hung loosely around her frail frame, and the flickering light overhead cast long, wavering shadows across her face. "May I come in?" Sister Agnes's voice was low, almost fragile. Elara nodded, gesturing to the chair opposite her, of course. The woman sat slowly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. For a moment, neither spoke, the weight of unspoken truths pressing down on them. Finally, Sister Agnes exhaled softly. "You re-stirring things that many hoped would remain buried," she said, her voice trembling just slightly. Elara met her gaze, steady but filled with an ache that had never fully healed. "I have to know the truth. For the children. For myself." Sister Agnes looked away, biting her lip. "There are things I witnessed, things I wished I could change, but fear keeps many silent." The confession hung between them like a fragile thread. Elara reached out, placing a reassuring hand over the older woman's. "It's not too late. We can make a difference now." A faint, almost imperceptible nod was her only answer. Later, as Elara made her way down a shadowed corridor, the faint strains of a lullaby drifted through the stillness. It was a haunting melody, sweet and sorrowful, weaving through the silence like a ghost. She paused, closing her eyes as the notes twisted memories into sharp fragments. Her breath hitched as the past collided with the present, each word of the song a reminder of pain disguised as comfort. From the corner of her eye, she caught a figure standing across the courtyard. "Meh!" Grayson's tall, imposing silhouette was unmistakable, his cold and unreadable face partially obscured by the failing light. His presence was a dark stain on the fading day, a warning that the fight for truth would not come without cost. Elara swallowed her fear, steeling herself against the oppressive weight of the orphanage's secrets. The path ahead was fraught with danger, but she was no longer the frightened child who had once hidden behind lullabies. She was a teacher now, a survivor, ready to confront the shadows beneath the facade. The night deepened, and with it, the silence grew heavier, but Elara's resolve burned brighter. Somewhere within these walls, the truth awaited, fragile yet fierce, ready to shatter the silence once and for all. And with that thought, she stepped forward into the darkness, a whisper of hope in the gathering gloom. The days that followed were a delicate dance between revelation and restraint. Elara spent hours poring over the ledger and other forgotten documents, piecing together a mosaic of pain and resilience. Sister Agnes became a quiet ally, her cautious admissions providing vital clues while revealing the depth of her own torment. The staff room conversations were laced with unspoken tensions, and Elara could feel the eyes of those loyal to Mr. Grayson watching, waiting. In one moment, she found herself standing before a faded portrait of the orphanage's founder. The once bright eyes in the painting seemed to glare down at her, a silent accusation or perhaps a plea. Elara pressed her palm to the cool glass, feeling the weight of history pressing in, urging her onward. Each night, the lullabies echoed through the halls, their melodies now fractured and heavy with meaning. Elara sang softly to herself when the silence became too much a fragile shield against the ghosts that haunted her. She knew this was only the beginning. The facade was cracking, and beneath it, the scars of the past waited to be uncovered. But with every step deeper into the orphanage's heart, the danger grew. Mere. Grayson's shadow loomed ever closer, a reminder that some silences were guarded fiercely. Yet, Elara's courage was no longer fragile. It was forged in the fires of her own trauma, tempered by the hope that healing was possible. The orphanage was a place of broken songs and whispered fears, but Elara was determined to transform it into a sanctuary where silence no longer protected pain, but nurtured healing. And as dawn broke over the ancient rooftops, she felt, for the first time in years, that the lullabies might one day be reborn not as veils of sorrow, but as anthems of survival. The attic was a forgotten chamber, cloaked in shadows, where dust motes danced in the shafts of pale afternoon light that filtered through a grimy window. Elara Winters ascended the creaking wooden stairs with a quiet urgency, her footsteps muffled by the worn carpet runner. She had come here following a whispered rumor from one of the children, a hint that something long hidden might still exist within these walls. Her fingers traced the rough, peeling paint of the doorframe as she pushed it open, revealing a cramped space cluttered with remnants of the past, broken furniture, faded photographs, and boxes sealed tight with brittle tape. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and forgotten years. Elara knelt beside a loose floorboard that shifted under the slightest pressure, revealing a narrow cavity beneath. Inside lay a leather-bound journal, its cover cracked and edges frayed, smelling of age and secrets. Her heart pounded as she lifted it gently, the weight of its contents heavier than the book itself. She settled cross-legged on the floor, fingers trembling slightly as she opened the journal. The pages were filled with neat, precise handwriting, the voice of a child trapped in the orphanage's twisted embrace. The entries spoke of nights filled with lullabies that soothed wounds no one dared to acknowledge, of whispered threats and bruises hidden beneath smiles. Each word carved deeper into Elara's memory, stitching together fragments of a shared pain she had long tried to bury. As twilight deepened, the attic grew colder, the flickering light from Elara's lantern casting elongated shadows that seemed to flicker like ghosts around her. Her breath caught as she read a passage describing a night when a caretaker's shadow loomed too close, the lullaby turning into a sinister chant that silenced cries before they could form. A sudden creak on the staircase jolted her from the pages. She snapped the journal shut and extinguished the lantern, heart hammering as footsteps approached. Meh! Grayson's tall frame appeared in the doorway, his face unreadable, eyes dark and cold. "Curiosity can be dangerous, Miss Winters," he said, voice low and menacing. "Some things are better left buried." Elara met his gaze steadily, refusing to show the fear twisting inside her. "The children deserve the truth," she replied quietly. "The silence has lasted too long." A tense silence stretched between them before Grayson's lips curled into a thin, chilling smile. "Be careful. Not all truths lead to healing." He turned and disappeared down the stairs, leaving Elara alone once more, the shadows pressing in like a warning. That night, in the sparse confines of her modest room, Elara spread the journal's pages before her. The lullabies that once had been a balm now echoed as fractured melodies, their comforting tones distorted by the shadows of pain they had veiled. Memories long suppressed surfaced, the quiet tears in dark corners, the invisible scars beneath clean clothes, the whispered promises never kept. Tears slipped down her cheeks as she traced the words, the weight of the past mingling with a fierce determination. She was no longer a silent victim. She was a witness, a guardian for those still trapped in the orphanage's web. The next morning, during a brief exchange in the hallway, Sister Agnes appeared beside her, her usual stern expression softened by an unspoken understanding. In a swift, subtle motion, she pressed a folded note into Elara's palm before slipping away. Elara unfolded it cautiously. Inside was a list of names, dates, and a promise of hidden files stored in the basement, evidence that could unravel the carefully maintained Phi-Aid. A fragile alliance had been forged in the shadows, and with it, a glimmer of hope. But as the day wore on, the orphanage's atmosphere thickened, the lullabies continuing in the background like a haunting refrain. Elara knew the path ahead would be perilous. Mr. Grayson's gaze lingered too long, the weight of his warning heavy in the air. Yet the journal had shattered the silence. The fragments of truth were beginning to weave together, and Elara was ready to follow their thread, no matter where it might lead. Elara stepped cautiously down the narrow corridor, the faded wallpaper peeling at the edges like the fragile veneer of the orphanage itself. The muffled echoes of children's footsteps and whispered conversations wove through the air, punctuated by the distant haunting strains of a lullaby drifting from the nursery. It was a melody she knew too well, once a balm for restless nights, but now a reminder of pain carefully concealed beneath its soothing notes. Her heart tightened as she approached the staff room, where she sensed the heavy gaze of Mr. Grayson lurking like a shadow. The caretaker's imposing figure emerged from the dimness, his tall frame casting a long, cold silhouette against the peeling paint, his eyes, sharp and unreadable, fixed on Elara with a quiet menace. "Miss Winters," he said, his voice low and measured, "I trust you understand the importance of order in this place. Curiosity can be dangerous." Elara met his gaze steadily, refusing to be cowed. "I'm here to help the children, Mr. Grayson. They deserve safety and truth." A faint smirk flickered across his face before it hardened again. "Be careful where your truths lead you. Not all stories should be unearthed." The warning hung in the air as he turned and strode away, leaving Elara with a chill that settled deep in her bones. But beneath the surface of fear, a flicker of resolve ignited within her. In the classroom, the children huddled quietly, their eyes wary but curious. Mira sat near the window, her pale hair catching the weak sunlight, her wide eyes darting furtively around the room. Elara approached slowly, mindful of the fragile trust she had begun to build. During a moment when the other children were distracted, Mira slipped a small, folded note into Elara's hand. The paper was worn, the ink smudged, but legible. It spoke of whispered fears and silent suffering, a call for help wrapped in the fragile hope of being heard. Elara's chest tightened with a blend of sorrow and determination. This was more than a note. It was a lifeline. Elsewhere, Tommy gathered a small group of orphans in a secluded corner of the yard. His youthful energy was infectious, and despite the oppressive atmosphere, a spark of rebellion kindled in their eyes. Together, they whispered an altered lullaby, the words bending away from submission toward courage. Their voices trembled, yet grew stronger with each repetition, threading defiance through the familiar melody. Elara watched from a distance, her heart swelling with a cautious hope. These small acts of rebellion, though quiet and fragile, were the first threads unraveling decades of enforced silence. Later, in the dim staff room, Sister Agnes lingered near the doorway, her sharp features etched with worry and guilt. Though her habit was faded and her posture stiff with years of duty, her eyes held a glimmer of something new, an unspoken acknowledgement of Elara's courage. Their gazes met in a brief, charged moment, and Sister Agnes offered a subtle nod. It was a silent promise of support, fragile but vital. The night deepened, and Elara sat by the window of her small quarters, the note from Mira resting on her desk. The lullabies echoed faintly from the children's rooms, a haunting reminder of the past, but also a signal of the change beginning to stir. She whispered the words softly to herself, a fragile hymn of defiance and hope. The threads of resistance were weaving quietly, but unmistakably, through the fabric of the orphanage's silence. Elara knew the road ahead would be perilous. Mr. Grayson's shadow loomed large, and the cost of truth could be high. But as the children's whispered rebellions grew bolder, and as Sister Agnes's support hinted at a fracture in the oppressive order, she felt a renewed strength settle within her. The lullabies were no longer just veils to hide pain. They were becoming the first notes of a new song, a song of resilience, courage, and the fragile but fierce hope that even in the darkest places, light could find a way in. And Elara was determined to be the voice that carried it forward. The next day, the atmosphere was thick with unspoken tension. Grayson's presence was more pronounced, his eyes following Elara's every move with a silent threat. Yet, the children's spirits flickered with quiet rebellion. Mira lingered near Elara during lessons, her cautious trust growing, while Tommy's whispered chants echoed softly in the halls. Sister Agnes, though still bound by fear and habit, began leaving subtle hints and overheard conversation. A misplaced file that nudged Elara closer to the truth hidden beneath the orphanage's calm exterior. Each small victory was a stitch in the tapestry of change, fragile yet unyielding. Elara's resolve hardened. She would face the looming storm head-on, for the children who had no voice, for the scars that demanded to be seen, and for the lullabies that had finally begun to sing of freedom. As dusk fell, the orphanage seemed to hold its breath, caught between the heavy weight of silence and the first, trembling notes of rebellion rising from within its walls. The threads of resistance were pulling taut, ready to unravel the long-held shadows. And Elara stood at the center, ready to weave a new story from the fractured lullabies of the past. The dim light of late afternoon filtered through the tall, narrow windows of the orphanage's common room, casting long, softened shadows that stretched like fingers across the worn wooden floorboards. Elara sat quietly on a battered armchair, the faint hum of a lullaby drifting from the adjacent hall, its melody at once comforting and haunting. It was a tune she had known since childhood, one that had once promised peace, but now echoed with the weight of unspoken grief. Mira approached cautiously, her pale hair catching the last golden rays, her wide eyes flickering with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. The girl's presence was almost ethereal, fragile yet determined, as if she carried the weight of 1,000 unsaid secrets on her slender shoulders. Elara's heart tightened. She recognized that look all too well. "You don't have to speak if you're not ready," Elara whispered gently, her voice barely louder than the fading lullaby. Mira hesitated, her gaze dropping to the floor before it flicked back up, meeting Elara's with a flicker of trust. "Sometimes," she murmured, "the silence is louder than the words." That simple sentence hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Elara nodded, understanding the unspoken pain beneath it. Over the past weeks, she had observed the children's smiles bright and fleeting as fragile masks concealing the scars beneath. The lullabies, once a balm, had become complicated symbols, soothing melodies overshadowed by the shadows they sought to drown out. Later that night, the orphanage transformed under the cloak of darkness, the hallways, usually bustling with the clatter of day, now stretched silent and cold. Elara moved quietly, her footsteps softened by the thick rugs, drawn by faint murmurs seeping through the cracks in closed doors. The whispers were hesitant, fragmented, yet laced with a fragile bravery. Children shared stolen fragments of their stories, their voices trembling but resolute. Elara pressed her ear to a door near the end of the corridor, catching snippets of Mira's voice intertwined with Tommy's energetic chatter. Tommy, the spirited boy with tousled hair and a mischievous grin, spoke fervently about small acts of defiance, sneaking extra seconds of playtime, hiding contraband drawings, and staging minor rebellions against the suffocating rules imposed by Missa. "Grayson's regime we have to fight in small ways," Tommy insisted, eyes sparkling with youthful fire. "Otherwise they'll crush us completely." Mira's response was quieter but no less fierce. "It's hard to believe we can win. But maybe if we keep whispering, the silence will break." Elara felt a shiver run down her spine. The children's quiet rebellion was a fragile thread of hope woven through the oppressive fabric of the orphanage. Yet she knew how dangerous it was to hope too freely. Days later, Elara found herself in the overgrown garden, a rare patch of wildness amidst the rigid order of the orphanage. Sister Agnes stood nearby, her sharp features softened by the twilight. The faded habit she wore seemed almost a shroud, worn not just by time, but by the burden of secrets she carried. Their eyes met, and in that silent exchange, Elara sensed the conflict tearing at the older woman's conscience. Sister Agnes was a guardian of order but also a silent witness to suffering. Her subtle gestures averted gaze, hesitant words of encouragement told Elara that the battle within the orphanage was not hers alone. The days that followed were a delicate dance of whispered confidences and guarded glances. Mira, little by little, began to unfurl the tangled threads of her past. Elara listened without pressure, allowing the girl's story to emerge in fragments, shadows of darker days. Moments of fear and loneliness that mirrored Elara's own buried memories. Each revelation chipped away at the carefully constructed silence that had long protected the abusers, Elara's resolve hardened, even as self-doubt gnawed at her. Could she protect these children? Could she face the ghosts of her own past without breaking? One evening, as the children gathered for their nightly routine, the lullabies took on a new meaning. No longer merely songs of comfort, they became a testament to survival, fractured melodies that carried the weight of pain, but also whispered promises of resilience. Elara watched Mira, her small frame illuminated by the soft glow of a single candle, and felt a surge of fierce hope. The journey ahead would be perilous, the silence hard to shatter, but in the whispered stories and the quiet acts of rebellion, a fragile dawn was beginning to emerge. And as the last notes of the lullaby faded into the night, Elara knew that the true fight was only just beginning. The nursery was cloaked in the kind of dimness that seemed to absorb sound rather than reflect it. Elara Winters stood near the window, her fingers tracing the outline of a faded stain on the aged wooden floor. The pale light of the late afternoon stretched long shadows across the cracked walls, and somewhere beyond the glass, a faint, haunting lullaby wove through the corridors like a ghost of memory. It was soft, almost imperceptible, but it carried with it a weight far heavier than the melody itself. The lullabies had once comforted her, a fragile thread connecting her to a fleeting sense of safety amid the chaos of the orphanage. But now they twisted into something darker in her mind, a veil masking the unspeakable, a song hiding scars that words had long been denied. Elara's breath hitched as the melody grew clearer, a spectral accompaniment to the silence that pressed upon her chest. She pulled her cardigan tighter around her slender frame and turned away from the window, the room suddenly feeling colder despite the lingering warmth of the sun. Her footsteps echoed softly as she moved toward the door, careful not to disturb the few children nestled in the adjacent rooms. Each child seemed to carry their own silence, a silence heavier than the empty spaces between their whispered words and stolen glances. In the hallway, a faint shuffle caught her attention. Sister Agnes appeared, her aged figure framed by the muted light filtering through the stained glass. The sharp features of her face were softened by the well-worn habit, but there was a tension in her eyes, a quiet turmoil that mirrored Elara's own. Their gazes met, and in that brief moment, an unspoken understanding passed between them. Sister Agnes paused, then reached slowly into the folds of her habit, producing a small, folded piece of paper. She extended it toward Elara with a subtle nod before continuing down the corridor, her footsteps fading into the oppressive stillness. Elara unfolded the slip carefully. The handwriting was hurried but legible, a list of names, dates, and cryptic notes. It was the first tangible evidence she had received, a fragile thread that might unravel the dense web of silence suffocating the orphanage. Her heart pounded as she tucked the paper into her pocket. The risk was immense, but so was the necessity. The lullabies, once a balm for frightened children, had become a soundtrack for their repression. They sang of loss, of lives lived in shadows, of scars hidden beneath fragile smiles. Later, during quiet study time, Elara found Mira seated nearby. The small girl's pale hair caught the light, and her wide, watchful eyes flickered with a cautious curiosity. Mira leaned close, her voice barely a whisper as she hesitated before sharing a fragment of an old lullaby, a haunting melody, that resonated with Elara's own memories. The words were chilling and beautiful, a mixture of comfort and unease. Mira's trust was a fragile blossom, and Elara knew that breaking through the silence would require patience and tenderness. As the day waned, Elara sought refuge in the deserted garden. The cold air bit at her cheeks, the sky painted in bruised purples and fading golds. The stillness was almost tangible, yet the echo of the lullabies lingered, twisting in her mind like spectral threads of pain and endurance. She closed her eyes, letting the silence envelop her. The weight of the past pressed down, but beneath it, a flicker of determination burned bright. The journey ahead was fraught with peril, but Elara was no longer alone. The faintest glimmer of hope stirred within the shadows, a promise that the silence might one day be broken. And when it was, the orphanage would never be the same. Night crept in, and the orphanage settled into a hushed lull. The children were tucked into their beds, the only sounds the soft rustle of sheets and the distant hum of the old pipes. Elara sat by the window in her sparse room, the folded paper resting on the nightstand beside her. Her fingers traced the edges, a lifeline in the growing darkness. The lullabies played in her mind, fractured and haunting, a reminder of the pain that had once been silenced, now demanding to be heard. She whispered the words softly to herself, a fragile incantation against the weight of memory. Tomorrow would bring more challenges. But tonight, in the quiet, she allowed herself a moment of fragile hope. The silence was heavy, but it was no longer complete. That night, Elara dreamed. The lullabies transformed, their notes weaving through her sleep like threads of light and shadow. Faces appeared, children lost to time, voices long stifled by fear and repression. They sang to her, their melodies broken yet beautiful, urging her onward. She awoke with the dawn, heart pounding, the weight of silence pressing anew, but tempered by an unyielding resolve. The path forward was uncertain, scarred and dangerous, but she would walk it nonetheless. For the children, for the truth, for the broken lullabies waiting to be reborn. The air in the main hall was thick with a fragile stillness, the kind that clings to old wood and faded memories. Late afternoon light filtered through the tall, narrow windows, casting long, wavering shadows across the worn floorboards. Elara stood at the front of the room, her slender fingers tracing the gentle curve of a well-loved lullaby, as she prepared the children for song time. The melody was familiar, a haunting refrain from her own childhood, but today, it carried a weight far heavier than nostalgia. She glanced around at the small faces turned toward her. Mira sat near the front, her pale hair catching the light, eyes wide yet guarded. Tommy fidgeted beside her, an eager spark in his bright eyes that contrasted sharply with the silence that had settled over the group. The others shuffled quietly, some clutching their blankets, others staring at the floor as if the very act of singing could fracture the fragile peace that held them together. Elara took a deep breath and began to sing softly, her voice a tentative thread weaving through the heavy air. The children's voices joined hers hesitantly, the melody faltering like a fragile bird testing its wings. The lullaby was supposed to soothe, to cradle the weary heart and hush restless fears. But today it felt like a cracked mirror reflecting not comfort, but the fractures beneath their smiles. Mira's eyes darted nervously, her small hands gripping the edge of her dress until her knuckles turned white. Elara caught the flicker of a shadow crossing her face, a silent scream trapped behind those watchful eyes. The lullaby seemed to echo a memory too sharp to bear, a moment folded into years of silence. Tommy's voice wavered, his usual energy dampened as he glanced toward Mir Grayson, who stood motionless in the doorway. The caretaker's tall, imposing figure was a dark silhouette against the fading light, his cold gaze unreadable yet heavy with unspoken menace. The children's voices faltered further, the warmth of the song eclipsed by the chill of his presence. Elara's heart tightened, but she steadied her voice, determined to see this moment through. The lullabies had once been their shield, their fragile sanctuary from the terrors that lurked in the shadows. Now they were fractured symbols not only of pain, but also of resilience yet to be reclaimed. From the far corner, Sister Agnes watched silently, her sharp features softened by the flicker of compassion in her eyes. The faded habit she wore seemed a fragile barrier against the weight of guilt she bore. She knew the silence that followed the songs all too well, the unspoken truths that clung to the walls of the orphanage like dust. As the last notes of the lullaby faded into the heavy air, a silence deeper than any before settled over the room. It was a silence that spoke volumes of scars hidden beneath fragile smiles, of voices stilled by fear, and of a past that refused to be forgotten. Elara met Mira's gaze and saw the flicker of something new, a fragile thread of trust, a hesitant hope. The lullabies were broken, yes, but not beyond repair. They could be reclaimed, reshaped into songs of survival and strength. The challenge lay ahead, daunting and fraught with danger. Minor. Grayson's shadow loomed large, a constant reminder of the forces determined to keep the past buried. Yet Elara felt a fierce resolve ignite within her. The fractured melodies would no longer silence their pain. Instead, they would herald the beginning of their voices rising together. As the children shuffled away, still caught between fear and hope, Elara lingered a moment longer. Her fingers brushed the edge of an old music book, its pages worn and fragile like the memories they contained. She whispered the lullaby once more, a promise to herself and the children that healing would come, even if it took time, and that the scars they bore would not define them. Outside, the wind stirred the bare branches against the orphanage walls, carrying with it the faintest echo of a new song, one fractured, yes, but filled with the possibility of dawn. And as Elara stepped into the fading light, she knew the journey was far from over. The lullabies had fractured, but from their pieces, a new melody would rise. She would see to that, no matter the cost. The hall emptied, the silence lingering like a breath held too long. Yet beneath it, a quiet stirring the first notes of courage, fragile but unyielding. And Elara's heart beat steady, a steady drum in the dark, calling them forward. The fractured lullabies would sing again. The corridors of the orphanage seemed narrower today. Shadows lengthening with the late afternoon light as Elara Winters moved quietly past the peeling walls that had once echoed with her own childhood fears. Her footsteps, soft but resolute, carried her toward the heart of the building, the place where power and silence intertwined in a suffocating embrace. She had sensed the shift coming, the storm that had been gathering under the orphanage's calm surface, now threatening to break free. And there, waiting with a cold patience, was Mr. Grayson. The moment their paths crossed in the dim hallway, the air thickened. Mr. Grayson's presence was imposing, his tall frame blocking the narrow passage as effectively as a gatekeeper barring entry. His eyes, sharp and unmoving, fixed on Elara with an unreadable expression that chilled her more than any raised voice could. "Miss Winters," he said, voice low and measured, "your enthusiasm is admirable, but some things are better left undisturbed." Elara met his gaze steadily, the memories of lullabies sung in the dead of night, once a balm now revealed as a cruel mask, fueling her resolve. "The children deserve truth," she replied quietly, her voice steady despite the tension knotting her stomach, "and safety." A faint, humorless smile flickered across Miss Grayson's lips as he leaned closer, the scent of old tobacco and cold authority hanging between them. "Safety," he echoed, "is found in order, and order requires silence." The threat was implicit, heavy as the silence that had long filled these halls. But Elara would not be cowed. She knew the stakes not just for herself, but for every child trapped in the orphanage's shadows. Her mind raced, seeking a path through the confrontation without igniting open conflict. "I am here to help," she said. "But hiding the past will only make the present more fragile." Mr. Grayson's eyes darkened, and with a curt nod, he stepped aside. "Be careful, Miss Winters. Some lines, once crossed, cannot be uncrossed without consequence." As the caretaker's footsteps faded, Elara exhaled, the tension in her shoulders easing just enough to remind her of the battle ahead. Later that day, in the quiet sanctuary of the classroom, the sunlight filtered through rain-streaked windows, casting fractured patterns across her face. She sat by the sill, the soft murmur of distant children echoing faintly, and felt the weight of the lullabies that had once cradled her to sleep. Now those melodies were fractured, their sweetness tainted by the scars beneath. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Sister Agnes entered hesitantly, her faded habit rustling with every cautious step. The older woman's eyes held a mixture of fear and determination as she approached Elara's desk and placed a neatly folded envelope before her. "I can't stay silent any longer," Sister Agnes whispered, her voice trembling. "There are files, records, things you need to see. But be careful. Elara unfolded the envelope, heart pounding as she glimpsed the typed pages and handwritten notes that detailed years of neglect and abuse, the hidden history behind the lullabies and the silence. This evidence was fragile but powerful, a key to unlocking the truth that could shatter the carefully maintained facade. "Thank you," Elara said softly, reaching out to squeeze Sister Agnes's hand. "You're not alone anymore." Outside the staff room, in the playroom's muted light, the children gathered in small clusters. Mira's pale hair caught the glow from a cracked window pane as she exchanged glances with Tommy, whose restless energy was tempered by a newfound quiet resolve. The oppressive silence that had long ruled their days was beginning to crack, subtle acts of defiance stirring beneath the surface, whispered words, shared secrets, small gestures of courage. Elara's presence had ignited a spark. The children's eyes, once wary and guarded, now flickered with hope. They were beginning to reclaim the voices that had been stifled for so long, but danger lurked close. Meh! Grayson's warnings echoed in Elara's mind, a stark reminder that the battle for truth was far from over. She would need every ounce of patience, every thread of emotional intelligence she possessed, to navigate the gathering storm. As dusk settled over the orphanage, the lines had been drawn clear and unyielding. And Elara stood ready to face whatever consequences lay ahead, determined to break the silence that had bound them all for too long. The lullabies, once fractured and hollow, now hummed faintly in her heart, a promise of resilience, a fragile song of hope yet to be fully sung. And the night was only just beginning. Elara Winters stood stiffly in the dim staff room, the low hum of the orphanage settling around her like a heavy shroud. Across the narrow space, Miss Grayson's cold eyes bore into her, a wall of silence thickening the air between them. The flickering light from a single overhead bulb cast angular shadows across his stern, unreadable face, emphasizing the lines of control and menace that seemed permanently etched there. Elara's heart pounded not just from fear, but from the fierce determination that had been building inside her for weeks. "You think you can come back here and unravel everything?" Mr. Grayson's voice was low, measured, but beneath it lurked a barely contained threat. "You don't understand how things work in this place." Elara met his gaze without flinching, despite the cold sweat pooling in her palms. "I understand more than you think. And I'm not alone anymore." The words hung between them, heavy and irrevocable. Grayson's lips pressed into a thin line, but before he could respond, the door creaked softly. Elara turned to see Sister Agnes slipping inside, her once faded habit now looking more worn than ever, her sharp features drawn tight with worry. Without a word, she approached Elara, her hands trembling as she extended a small bundle wrapped in brown paper. "You need this," Sister Agnes whispered, her voice barely audible over the distant echo of a lullaby drifting through the orphanage halls. "It's everything: the journals, letters, notes." Hidden for years, Elara accepted the package with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. Sister Agnes's eyes met hers, conveying a silent pact of trust and courage. "I'm tired of hiding," the older woman added, her resolve shining through the fear. Later that night, in the solitude of her modest room, Elara spread the fragile documents across her wooden desk. The yellowed pages crackled softly under her fingers as she read the haunting testimonies of children long silenced. Names, dates, and events painted a grim portrait of abuse masked by the lullabies that once soothed and now suffocated. Every line was a scar reopened, every confession a whispered scream that echoed through the years. Yet within those pages, Elara found strength, a roadmap to justice and healing. Outside, the orphanage slept, but Elara's mind raced. The faint melody of a lullaby floated through the cracked window, bittersweet and haunting. It was a reminder of the past and a call to action. In the hallway, footsteps echoed faintly behind her, a reminder that Mr. Grayson's shadow still loomed large. But Elara was no longer the frightened child she once was. Clutching the evidence close, she resolved to shatter the silence once and for all. to give voice to the voiceless and light to the darkest corners of the orphanage. The breaking point had come, and with it, the fragile hope of a new dawn. The common room was unusually quiet for a place usually filled with the restless energy of children. Yet tonight, there was a different kind of sound, whispers, threading through the shadows, fragile but persistent. Elara stood at the threshold, her heart tightening as she watched small clusters of orphans leaning in close. Their voices a cautious defiance against the silence that had long wrapped the orphanage in its cold embrace. It was a crack in the fortress of fear that had kept them voiceless for so long. Elara's eyes found Mira among the group, the pale-haired girl sitting slightly apart, her wide eyes flickering with an uncertain light. Tonight, there was something different in Mira's posture, a tentative courage that had not been there before. Slowly, Mira moved toward Elara, each step deliberate and fragile, like a bird testing the wind. They found their way to the courtyard beneath the ancient oak, its gnarled branches stretching protectively above them as the late afternoon sun dipped low, casting warm amber light mixed with long, encroaching shadows. Mira's hands trembled as she folded them in her lap, her voice barely above a whisper, but steadying with each word. She spoke of a past shrouded in silence, fragments of memories that had been locked away, hidden beneath layers of fear and shame. Elara listened, her own breath caught in the weight of the moment. It was the first time Mira had allowed the walls around her pain to crumble, revealing the scars beneath the surface. Back inside, the other children began to mimic the bravery sparked by Mira's revelation. Whispers turned into soft declarations, small confessions shared in the safety of their newfound trust. Tommy, ever the restless spirit, found his voice in a rebellious joke that drew nervous laughter. The sound was a balm and a beacon, the first notes of a song long silenced. Yet not everyone welcomed this fragile awakening. Mayor Grayson's cold presence loomed like a shadow over the orphanage, his steps heavy and deliberate as he sought out Elara. His voice, low and threatening, cut through the corridors like a warning. He sought to snuff out the flicker of rebellion before it could ignite into flame. But the children's whispers were no longer secrets. They were a chorus of resistance. Amidst the mounting tension, Sister Agnes made a quiet but powerful choice. In the flickering candlelight of the staff room, she slipped a folded piece of paper into Elara's hand, a silent act of solidarity that spoke volumes. The paper held evidence, a key that could unlock the truth long buried beneath years of silence. Elara felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders, but also a surge of determination. The voices emerging around her were fragile, yes, but they were real and growing stronger. The silence that once ruled this place was breaking, and with it, the hope for healing and justice began to take root. As the night deepened, the lullabies that once masked pain began to transform in Elara's mind, no longer songs of suppression, but anthems of resilience. The journey ahead was uncertain and fraught with danger, but for the first time in a long while, the children's voices were not alone in the dark. They had found an echo in Elara's unwavering resolve, a promise that their stories would no longer be hidden in silence. The cold air of the common room seemed to thicken with tension as Elara stood before the gathered orphans and staff. Her voice steady but filled with an urgency that echoed in the quiet space. The flickering overhead light cast long shadows across the faces of the children, some wide-eyed with fear, others clenched in hesitant resolve. Tonight would mark the turning point. The fractured lullabies that once masked their pain were about to be unraveled, their silence shattered. Elara's gaze swept across the crowded room, pausing on Mira, who sat near the front, clutching a blanket tightly around her small frame. The pale strands of Mira's hair shone faintly under the dim light, her wide, watchful eyes fixed on Elara with a mixture of trust and fear. Beside Mira, Tommy bounced nervously on the edge of his seat, his bright eyes betraying a restless energy that mirrored the charged atmosphere. We've carried these secrets too long, Elara began, her voice a low murmur that gradually strengthened. Tonight we speak not just for ourselves, but for every child who's ever been silenced here. Murmurs rippled through the group, a fragile chorus of agreement and apprehension. The oppressive weight of years hung in the air, thick as the dust motes that danced in the slanting beams of moonlight from the cracked windows. Elara took a deep breath, feeling the familiar sting of old memories pressing at her chest, but she pushed forward. The orphans deserved a chance to reclaim their stories and their lives. Suddenly, the door to the room creaked open, and Sister Agnes appeared, her aged frame silhouetted against the hallway light. In her hand, she held a sealed envelope, the paper worn but unyielding. Her sharp eyes met Elara's for a brief instant, a silent exchange of hope and fear passing between them. With a quiet step, she approached and placed the envelope on the table beside Elara. "This is what we need," Sister Agnes whispered, her voice trembling despite her stern demeanor. "Proof that can't be ignored." Elara nodded, fingers brushing the edges of the envelope. Inside lay the journal she had discovered weeks ago, along with corroborating notes and testimonies she had painstakingly gathered. It was the key to breaking the cycle. Just then, the heavy footsteps of Mr. Grayson echoed down the corridor. The children stiffened, and a hush fell over the room as the imposing figure filled the doorway. His cold, unreadable face bore the rigid mask of control, but beneath it, Elara sensed the flicker of unease. "What's going on here?" he demanded, voice sharp as winter frost. Elara met his gaze without flinching. "We re-speaking the truth, Mr. Grayson. The silence ends now." The caretaker's eyes narrowed, his tall figure casting a looming shadow across the room. "You're remaking a grave mistake," he warned, but the tremor in his tone betrayed his confidence. Before he could advance, Elara motioned to the children. One by one they rose, their voices initially soft but growing stronger with each confession. Mira stepped forward last, her grip on Elara's hand tightening as she drew a shaky breath. I want to tell you what happened to me," Mira said, voice barely above a whisper. Her words spilled out like fractured melodies, revealing the dark truths hidden beneath the orphanage's facade. The room held its breath, the silence finally broken. Fear mingled with hope as the survivors reclaimed their voices, igniting a spark of resilience that would not be easily extinguished. Outside, the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, casting a pale glow on the battered walls, a fragile promise of healing to come. But even as the air filled with the sound of voices long stifled, the question remained, could the orphanage, scarred and shaken, emerge from this storm intact? Elara knew the path ahead would be fraught with pain and resistance, yet in this shattered silence lay the seed of a new beginning. And so, with the lullabies transformed from veils of sorrow into anthems of survival, the children and their guardian stood together, ready to face whatever darkness still lingered in the shadows. The air within the orphanage felt thick, almost suffocating, with an uneasy stillness that didn't quite settle yet refused to dissipate. The revelation of years of hidden abuses had shattered the fragile equilibrium that had held the place together. And now the walls themselves seemed to tremble under the weight of unspoken grief and fractured trust. Elara Winters moved quietly through the dimly lit common room, her footsteps gentle on the worn wooden floor. The faint scent of aged wood mingled with the stale remnants of antiseptic and faint traces of lavender, an attempt to mask the lingering sorrow that clung to every corner. In a small circle around her sat Mira, her pale hair disheveled, eyes wide and shimmering with unshed tears, and Tommy fidgeting restlessly, his freckled cheeks flushed with a mixture of fear and confusion. "It's okay," Elara murmured softly, her voice a balm against the storm raging within the children. "We're safe now. We're going to get through this together." Mira's gaze flickered to Elara's, searching for certainty in the shadow depths of those expressive eyes. "But what about them? Will they come back?" Tommy's small hand clenched around Elara's, his usual curiosity dimmed by the rawness of their shared ordeal. The scary man. The one who hurt us. Elara swallowed hard, feeling the familiar tightening in her chest. Grayson's looming presence still haunted the corridors, even in his absence, like a cold shadow stretching long and dark. But now, with the truth uncovered, that shadow had begun to recede. No, Elara answered firmly, though her voice trembled slightly. He won't come back. Weavy made sure of that. The children nodded slowly, some tears slipping free, their small bodies trembling with the release of long-held fear. Across the hallway, Sister Agnes lingered in the shadows, her aged hands clutching a small envelope tightly. Her sharp features bore the weight of years spent in silent complicity, but tonight something had shifted. Gathering her courage, she approached Elara, who looked up in surprise as the envelope changed hands. This might help," Sister Agnes whispered, her voice hoarse with emotion. "Evidence Ivy kept hidden. Afraid of what it would mean." Elara's fingers brushed over the worn paper, a lifeline of proof in the storm. The moment was heavy with unspoken guilt and cautious hope, as if the very act of sharing the truth was a tentative step toward redemption. The orphanage itself seemed alive with unrest. Down the hall, groups of children gathered in hushed clusters, their faces etched with confusion, hurt, and a fragile spark of defiance. The staff moved hurriedly, their expressions a mix of shock and apprehension, attempting to impose order on the chaos that threatened to engulf them all. In the midst of this turmoil, Elara found herself drawn to the center of the storm. Her voice, steady but soft, began to rise above the murmurs as she called the children and staff together in the main hall. "We cannot undo what has happened," she said, eyes scanning the tired, frightened faces before her. "But we can choose what comes next. We can break the silence that hurt us. We can build a place where we are safe, where our voices are heard, and where healing begins." A flicker of something new, resilience, perhaps sparked in the gathering. The oppressive hush that had long protected secrets began to fracture, replaced by a tentative, trembling chorus of whispered agreements and hopeful glances. Elara's heart ached as she recognized the long road ahead. Scars would remain, and trust would have to be earned anew with every step. But for the first time in a long while, the orphanage breathed with a fragile promise, one of survival, of resilience, and of a future reclaimed. As she looked at the children, Mira's guarded eyes slowly softening, Tommy's restless energy finding a quiet focus, Elara knew that the journey was far from over. Yet, in this fragile dawn, the seeds of healing had been sown. She would be their guide, their protector, and their voice. Together, they would navigate the aftermath of truth, transforming pain into strength and silence into song. And as the first tentative notes of a new lullaby rose softly from a small cluster of children, Elara allowed herself a breath, a moment of cautious hope, before the night's long vigil continued. The orphanage was broken, yes, but no longer silent. The afternoon sun filtered weakly through the cracked panes of the orphanage's common room, casting fractured shards of light across the worn wooden floorboards. The room, usually heavy with silence or whispered fears, today carried a tentative new energy. Elara Winters stood at the center, her dark hair pulled back tightly, eyes gleaming with quiet determination. Around her, the children gathered in a loose circle, their faces a mix of curiosity, apprehension, and fragile hope. "Today," Elara began, her voice soft but steady, "we're going to sing the lullabies again. But this time they won't be songs to hush away pain. They will be songs of strength, songs of hope, songs that belong to you." A hush fell over the room, the children exchanging uncertain glances. The lullabies were woven into the very fabric of their lives here, once a source of comfort, now a reminder of old wounds. The idea of reclaiming them felt both strange and frightening. Mira sat quietly near the back, her pale hair falling like a curtain over her watchful eyes. She shifted uneasily, fingers nervously twisting the hem of her threadbare dress. Elara caught her gaze and offered a gentle smile, encouraging without pressuring. "It's okay to be scared," Elara said, kneeling to Mira's eye level. "But these songs, they can be different. We can make them ours. Slowly, tentative voices rose, tentative and wavering at first, like fragile glass beginning to resonate. The lullabies, once somber and haunting, were reshaped by small hands and hopeful hearts into melodies that shimmered with tentative light. Elara led, her own voice a whisper, threading through the children's, weaving a new tapestry from old threads. Mira's lips parted, a faint note escaping a fragile, trembling sound that grew steadier with each breath. The other children followed, their voices gaining strength, the room filling with a chorus that was not just a song, but a declaration. They were no longer silent, no longer broken. In the doorway, Sister Agnes watched, her sharp features softened by an expression that was part guilt, part relief. A single tear traced down her faded cheek, a silent acknowledgement of the past and a hopeful prayer for the future. The woman who had once been a keeper of order now became a witness to transformation. Tommy, the ever-energetic boy with tousled hair, clapped his hands as the last note faded. His bright laughter broke the stillness, rippling through the room like a fresh breeze. The children's smiles, tentative but genuine, blossomed amidst the lingering scars. Elara's heart swelled with bittersweet triumph. The lullabies, once fractured and dark, now carried the promise of healing. The journey would be long, the scars deep, but in this room, in this moment, hope had taken root. And as the children sang, their voices rising in unison, Elara knew that the silence was finally breaking. The days that followed saw a gradual but palpable shift within the orphanage. Song became a ritual, a shared language through which pain was acknowledged and resilience nurtured. Elara worked closely with the children, encouraging them to write new verses, to tell their stories through melody. The songs were imperfect, raw, but alive, a living testament to their survival. Mira, once the most silent and guarded, began opening up in small ways beyond the music. Her trust in Elara deepened, her pale eyes brightening with each shared secret and song. Sister Agnes too grew bolder, offering quiet support and occasionally lending her own voice to the circle, yet shadows lingered. Grayson's oppressive presence still cast a pall over the orphanage's halls, and the scars of the past did not fade overnight. Elara remained vigilant, knowing that healing was not linear, and that each melody sung was a fragile step forward. One afternoon, as the children gathered beneath the sprawling branches of the old oak tree in the yard, Elara led them in a new song, one she had crafted from fragments of their stories, a hymn of endurance and hope. The lyrics spoke of broken wings mended and silent voices heard. The children's voices rose strong and clear, carrying over the walls that had once enclosed their suffering. Nearby, Mira's gaze lifted to the sky, a small smile curving her lips. Tommy danced among the shadows, laughter ringing like bells. Elara watched them, a quiet smile touching her own lips. The lullabies were no longer shadows of pain, but beacons of light, fragile, yes, but fiercely alive. As dusk settled, she whispered to herself, "We are not silent anymore." And in that promise, the orphanage breathed anew. But even as hope blossomed, questions lingered in Elara's mind. Could these songs truly erase the deep-rooted scars? Could the children's voices, reclaimed and strong, withstand the darkness that still lurked beyond the walls? The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in years, Elara felt the stirring of something precious, belief in the power of healing. The lullabies had been fractured, but from their broken melodies, a new song was born, one of survival, resilience, and the unyielding light of hope. And the music would not stop. The afternoon light filtered softly through the tall, narrow windows of the classroom, casting a muted golden glow over the worn wooden desks and peeling paint of the walls. Elara sat alone, the quiet punctuated only by the distant murmur of children finishing their lessons. Her fingers absently traced the faint, jagged scars on her wrists, silent testaments to the years she had carried within her like invisible burdens. For so long, she had hidden these marks beneath sleeves and smiles, convinced that strength meant erasing every trace of pain. Yet, Here in this room, the same room where Lullabies had once sung her to uneasy sleep, she realized that these scars were not merely wounds to be concealed, but stories etched into her skin, reminders of survival. A soft knock at the door broke her reverie. Mira stepped inside, her pale hair catching the light, eyes wide but resolute. Without a word, she lifted the sleeve of her own thin arm, revealing a faded scar that mirrored Elara's in both shape and depth. Elara's breath caught. In that shared moment of quiet revelation, an unspoken understanding passed between them, an acknowledgement of pain, yes, but also of endurance. "You don't have to hide it," Elara whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of sorrow and hope. "It's a part of you, but it's not all of you." Mira's eyes glistened, the walls she had built around her beginning to crumble. "I'm scared," she admitted softly, voice barely above a whisper. "But I want to be stronger." Elara reached out, gently squeezing Mira's hand. "We'll be stronger together." As the days wore on, this fragile bond blossomed. More children began to reveal their own hidden scars, some physical, others etched deep within their souls. Elara listened without judgment, offering a refuge where vulnerability was met with empathy rather than fear. From a distance, Sister Agnes observed these moments with a heaviness in her chest. The stern lines of her weathered face softened as she witnessed the transformation growing within the orphanage. The once oppressive silence was giving way to voices tentative but growing stronger. It was a symphony of resilience, each note a testament to the human spirit's capacity to heal. One afternoon, laughter bubbled through the hallways as Tommy playfully bumped elbows with Mira, their joy a beacon piercing the lingering shadows. These small acts of normalcy, of connection, wove threads of hope into the fabric of the orphanage's fractured heart. Elara knew the road ahead would be difficult. Scars did not vanish overnight, nor did the memories that accompanied them. But in embracing their wounds, in sharing their stories, the children were reclaiming their power. And in doing so, Elara found a renewed strength within herself, a quiet, unshakable resolve to nurture this fragile new beginning. As twilight deepened outside, Elara hummed a lullaby, not one of concealment, but of survival. The melody rose gently, weaving through the rooms and hearts alike, a song reborn from silence and scars. It was a promise that though pain remained, so too did hope. And as the last light faded, the orphanage breathed anew, cradled in the delicate balance between vulnerability and strength. The journey of healing was far from over, but for the first time in a long while, it felt possible. Elara closed her eyes, the lullaby lingering on her lips, a fragile dawn breaking within her soul, ready to face whatever tomorrow would bring. The morning sun spilled gently through the tall, arched windows of the common room, casting long beams of light on the worn wooden floorboards. Elara stood at the front of the room, her heart pounding with a quiet mixture of anticipation and apprehension. Around her, the children settled into a loose circle, their small bodies shifting nervously on the threadbare rugs. The usual cloak of silence that had once blanketed this space felt thinner today, more fragile but no less potent. Today, Elara began softly, her voice steady but warm. We're going to try something new. A time where we all can share what we're feeling. No one has to speak if they don't want to, but the option is here. We'll listen to each other, and we'll respect each other's stories. A faint murmur rippled through the group. Mira sat with her knees drawn up, her pale hair catching the light, her wide eyes flicking between Elara and the other children. Tommy shifted beside her, his usual restless energy tamped down as he watched, curious but uncertain. Elara scanned the faces around her, noting the subtle signs of tension, a clenched jaw, a quick glance away, a trembling lip. This was the beginning of unraveling years of silence, a silence that had protected wounds too deep for words. "I know it's hard," Elara continued, "but sometimes, sharing even a little bit can make the burden lighter. And we're here to carry it together." A hesitant hand rose Mira's. Elara met her gaze, offering a gentle nod of encouragement. Mira's voice was barely above a whisper, but the words broke through the stillness. I am scared. The admission hung in the air, fragile and raw. Elara felt a lump in her throat, but held steady, letting the moment breathe. Thank you for sharing that, Mira, Elara said quietly. It's brave to say when you re-scared. Others followed, each sharing snippets of their fears, hopes, and small joys. The circle time stretched, weaving a tapestry of voices that had long been stifled. It was imperfect and tentative, but it was real. Later that day, Elara found herself in a quiet office where Sister Agnes sat behind a cluttered desk, her sharp features drawn in contemplation. The faded habit hung loosely from her frame, a visible reminder of years spent within these walls. The children are responding, Elara said, her voice low. But the staff, some are still hesitant. Old habits die hard. Sister Agnes sighed, the weight of her own past failures pressing down on her. I've seen too much silence protect too many secrets. It's difficult to undo that. But you were right, change must begin somewhere. Their conversation wove through moments of regret and shards of hope. Sister Agnes confessed her fears of reprisal and the challenge of reconciling her loyalty to the institution with her conscience. Elara listened, grateful for her subtle support and the fragile alliance forming. In the late afternoon light spilling through the courtyard, Mira and Tommy found themselves alone for a moment. The usual walls around Mira's silence seemed to soften. She glanced at Tommy, her eyes searching for something familiar in his lively gaze. Do you want to play? Tommy asked, a hopeful grin breaking across his face. Mira hesitated, then nodded. Laughter, hesitant at first, bubbled between them, cracking through the pervasive quiet that had long suffocated the children. It was a small rebellion, a reclaiming of innocence and joy. As dusk settled, Elara wandered the dimly lit hallways, her footsteps soft against the worn floor. The silence, once so oppressive, now held a different quality, less a shroud, more a space waiting to be filled with new sounds. From a distant room, a soft lullaby drifted through the air, tentative and trembling. Elara paused, letting the melody wash over her, a song reborn, carrying within it the echoes of pain and the fragile promise of healing. The journey ahead was uncertain. Trust was delicate, and the scars carried by both children and adults alike would not fade easily. But in this moment, as the lullaby wove through the orphanage's walls, Elara felt a cautious optimism take root. The foundations were being laid not on silence, but on truth, empathy, and resilience. She took a deep breath and stepped forward. The night was long, but the dawn was breaking. The following days unfolded in a rhythm both challenging and hopeful. Elara introduced regular circle times, where the children gathered to share stories, fears, and sometimes laughter. At first, the sessions were sparse, words faltering and held back by years of ingrained silence. Yet, with each meeting, the circle grew stronger, more open. Sister Agnes, while still constrained by her fears, found moments to offer subtle guidance to the staff, encouraging them to listen more and judge less. Her internal conflict became a quiet force pushing toward change. Elara also worked closely with Mrs. Langley, the school administrator. Initially a bureaucratic obstacle, Mrs. Langley's demeanor softened as she witnessed the children's gradual transformation. Though cautious, she began to support Elara's initiatives, understanding that the orphanage could no longer function as it once had. Mira's gradual opening was one of the most poignant signs of progress. She began to trust Elara and the other children, sharing fleeting smiles and, occasionally, whispered secrets. Her resilience became a beacon for others. Yet, resistance remained. Some staff clung to the old ways, and moments of silence still fell heavily over the orphanage like a storm cloud. Elara's patience was tested time and again, as was her resolve to protect the fragile trust blossoming amid the pain. One afternoon, as a storm raged outside, Elara sat with Mira in the quiet of the library. The rain pattered softly against the windows, a soothing backdrop to their conversation. Sometimes I still hear the lullabies, Mira whispered, but they don't scare me as much now. Elara reached out, taking Mira's hand gently. That's because we're remaking new songs now, songs that hold hope, not fear. Mira nodded slowly, a small smile breaking through the shadows. As night fell and the orphanage settled into a quieter calm, Elara looked out over the grounds. The road to healing was long and fraught with uncertainty, but the silence that once protected pain was breaking. Within these walls, new foundations were being laid, foundations built on courage, compassion, and the unyielding human spirit. And somewhere deep inside, Elara felt the first true flickers of peace. Outside the windows, the first stars began to appear, delicate points of light against the deepening sky. The orphanage, battered but unbroken, stood ready to face whatever dawn might bring. Elara turned from the window, her heart steady, her purpose clear. The Lullabies had changed, and so had she. The future was uncertain, but it was theirs to shape. The courtyard was an island of muted gold and rust, where autumn's breath had settled with a quiet finality. Leaves, delicate as brittle parchment, drifted lazily from the ancient branches of the sprawling oak, their descent a soft whisper against the stillness of the afternoon. Elara sat close beside Mira on the worn wooden bench beneath the tree's outstretched limbs, her hand resting gently on the girl's small one. The pale hair that framed Mira's face caught the light, almost luminescent against the shadowed backdrop of the orphanage's stone walls. Mira's wide eyes were fixed on the ground, tracing the patterns in the fallen leaves, as if they held secrets she dared not speak aloud. Her voice, when it came, was fragile, a barely audible thread weaving through the cold air. "I didn't always live here," she whispered, the words trembling with the weight of untold stories. Before, it was a different place, a dark one. They didn't sing lullabies. They only silenced us." Elara's heart tightened, the old ache stirring deep within her chest. She knew all too well the prisons built by silence and fear. "You are safe now," she said softly, her voice a balm against the cold. "Here you can be heard." Mira's eyes flickered, a flicker of hope kindling amidst the shadows that clung to her like a second skin. Slowly, she turned toward Elara, her gaze steadier now. "Can you teach me to sing again?" The simple question was a beacon in the dimness, a fragile plea for connection. Elara nodded, warmth spreading through her limbs. "We'll learn together." Inside the orphanage, the common room was dim and hushed, the fading light casting long shadows across the worn floorboards. Sister Agen sat quietly in a corner, her sharp features softened by the weight of years and unspoken regrets. She watched the growing trust between Elara and Mira with a mixture of relief and sorrow. Her hands trembled slightly as she rose and moved toward Elara's desk, where she placed a small bundle wrapped in faded cloth. The bundle contained old photographs, a testament to lives once lived, moments stolen by time and fear. It was a silent confession, a fragile offering of trust from a woman long burdened by silence. Elara's fingers brushed against the images, each one telling a story of pain and resilience, a mosaic of the orphanage's hidden history. That evening, near the stone fountain etched with years of wear, Tommy chased Mira with a playful grin, his laughter ringing out like a rare melody. Mira's hesitant smile blossomed as she darted away, the ghost of fear giving way to the fleeting joy of childhood. For a moment, the heavy atmosphere lifted, replaced by the lightness of innocent play, a defiant act of hope against the lingering darkness. As dusk deepened, Elara and Mira retreated to a quiet corner of the nursery, the room dim and safe. Elara hummed a lullaby, a melody once fractured by pain, now softened by the promise of renewal. Mira leaned against her, the warmth of the song weaving a delicate thread of comfort. The notes mingled with their breathing, a fragile symphony of healing and trust. In that shared silence, beneath the weight of old scars and new beginnings, Mira found a glimmer of light, a fragile dawn breaking through the long night. And Elara, too, felt the stirrings of hope, the knowledge that even in the deepest shadows, the smallest flame could cast away the darkness. But as the lullaby faded into the quiet, an unspoken question lingered in the air. Could this fragile bond withstand the coming storms? And would the light they kindled be enough to lead them all toward the healing they so desperately sought? The journey was far from over, but for the first time in a long while, the path ahead seemed illuminated not by the silence of forgotten pain, but by the song of resilience and the courage to face the past together. The dawn broke quietly over the orphanage, its light tentative yet insistent, filtering softly through the tall, arched windows of the common room. It was a morning unlike any the children or staff had known in years, still marked by the shadows of the past, yet pulsing with a fragile hope. Elara Winters stood by the edge of the room, her hands folded loosely in front of her, eyes scanning the faces of the children gathered for breakfast. The usual clamor was subdued. Instead, a cautious stillness hung in the air, as if the very walls themselves were holding their breath. For years, the orphanage had been a place where silence reigned, not the peaceful kind, but a heavy, suffocating quiet that masked pain and fear. Now that silence was broken, not with clamor or uproar, but with whispers of trust and tentative smiles. Mira sat nearby, her pale hair catching the sunlight, eyes wide yet softer than before, as she exchanged a shy glance with Tommy, whose unruly hair bounced as he shifted in his seat. Their laughter, when it came, was light and fragile, but genuine, a sound Elara had not dared hope to hear again within these walls. Elara felt the weight of those moments keenly. Each smile was a victory. Each step forward, a triumph over the scars etched deep into the souls of those who had once called this place home. She remembered the lullabies, those haunting songs that had once cradled her to sleep, but had also been a veil over darker truths. Now, those songs would be different. They would no longer be instruments of concealment, but of healing. Later, in the garden, the air was crisp with the scent of blooming flowers and freshly turned earth. Elara found herself drawn to the sight of Mira and Tommy playing amidst the wild flowers, their movements hesitant yet free. The garden was a small sanctuary, a place where the children could begin to rediscover innocence and joy beyond the orphanage's grey, confining walls. "Look, Elara," Mira whispered, her voice trembling but bright. "The flowers are growing." Elara smiled, a warmth spreading through her chest. "Yes, Mira, just like you." Their bond had deepened over weeks of shared trust and quiet conversations. Mira's guarded nature slowly gave way, revealing glimpses of a resilient spirit shaped by hardship but not defined by it. It was this resilience that Elara sought to nurture, not to erase the past, but to help the children carry it with strength. Inside, the orphanage was beginning to breathe differently. Sister Agnes met Elara in the small staff room, the faded habit betraying the years of service and the silent burdens she bore. Their conversation was low and earnest, heavy with the sorrow of past failures but underscored by a newfound resolve. "We've let them down for too long," Agnes confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "But it's not too late. Not if we stand together." Elara nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility settle firmly on her shoulders. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with challenges both seen and unseen. Yet, the promise of trust rebuilt and voices reclaimed was a beacon she could not ignore. The absence of Mr. Grayson was a palpable relief. His cold, imposing presence had once loomed over every corner, every whispered fear. Now the halls echoed with footsteps unburdened by dread. The children explored with tentative curiosity, their eyes bright with the wonder of uncharted freedom. But Elara knew the scars would not vanish overnight. Healing was a slow, delicate process, one that required patience, compassion, and unwavering courage. As the afternoon sun spilled through the windows, casting long shadows that slowly receded, she stood at the threshold of this fragile dawn. "We have a long way to go," she murmured to herself, "but we are no longer alone in the silence." And with that, the orphanage began to rewrite its story, not as a place of hidden pain, but as a sanctuary of hope and resilience, where lullabies would once again sing of survival and the promise of new beginnings. The journey was far from over, but for the first time in a long while the future felt possible. Outside, The wind carried the soft hum of a new song, one not of sorrow, but of life reclaimed, of voices rising from the shadows into the light. Elara closed her eyes and let the melody fill her, a whispered vow to protect, to heal, and to never let the silence fall again. As night approached, the orphanage settled into a quiet peace, fragile but enduring. Tomorrow held its own uncertainties, but tonight, they had the dawn, and that was enough to carry them forward. The sun rose slowly over the orphanage, casting long golden rays that spilled through the trees and pooled gently upon the courtyard where Elara stood. The air was crisp and carried a faint chill, yet in the heart of the aged building, warmth began to blossom anew. Today was different, marked not by silence or the haunting shades of old fears, but by the fragile rebirth of voices long stifled. Elara inhaled deeply, the scent of damp earth and distant wood smoke mingling with the sharp tang of morning dew. Around her, the children gathered hesitantly, their eyes wide and uncertain, yet shining with the spark of something new. The lullabies, the very songs that once shielded their pain in shadows, were about to be reborn. "Are you ready?" Elara asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper, but filled with a steady resolve. The children nodded in unison, a fragile chorus of courage. From the back of the group, Mira stepped forward. Her pale hair shimmered like a halo in the early light, her wide eyes reflecting a brave vulnerability that had taken months to nurture. She met Elara's gaze, and in that simple exchange, a silent promise passed between them of trust, of healing, of survival. Then, as if summoned by the moment itself, the first notes drifted from Mira's lips, soft, tentative, and trembling with emotion. Elara joined in, her voice weaving a steady thread through the melody. One by one, the children added their voices, hesitant at first but growing stronger, surer. The lullabies, once fractured by pain and silence, began to coalesce into a tapestry of resilience and hope. The courtyard filled with song, the notes soaring and falling like birds in flight. The walls, steeped in decades of sorrow, seemed to lean in and listen, absorbing the transformation as it unfurled. Each word carried the weight of memories, the scars etched deep into the fabric of their lives, but also the promise of something gentler, a new dawn. Sister Agnes watched from the shadowed veranda, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The years had worn her face with lines of regret and guarded sorrow, yet now, a flicker of relief softened her sharp features. She had been a silent witness to so much, bound by fear and complicity. But today, witnessing the children reclaim their voices, she felt a tentative redemption stir within her. The path ahead would be difficult, but for the first time in a long while, there was light. Tummy, ever the energetic sprite, bounced beside Mira, his bright eyes alight with wonder. His usual restlessness seemed tempered by the gravity of the moment, as if the act of singing together had stitched a fragile thread of belonging between them all. Far from the courtyard, the dim, narrow hallway that had once echoed only with silence now hummed faintly with the remnants of song. The peeling wallpaper and worn wooden floor bore witness to the transformation. Scars remained, but they no longer defined the space. The silence had been shattered, and with it, the power of hidden pain diminished. Elara felt a quiet surge of victory mingled with sorrow. The journey had been long and harrowing, confronting Mr. Grayson, unraveling the layers of secrecy, and battling the shadows within herself. But here, in this moment, surrounded by the reclaimed voices of the children she had vowed to protect, she found a measure of peace. As the lullabies faded into a gentle hush, Elara knelt to Mira's level, her eyes reflective pools of empathy and hope. "This is just the beginning," she said softly. "We will carry these songs with us, not to forget the past, but to heal from it." Mira smiled faintly, a small light kindling in her gaze. "Songs of survival," she whispered. Elara nodded, her own voice catching with emotion. "Songs of survival." Beyond the walls of the orphanage, the day grew brighter, the past no longer a shackle, but a foundation upon which to build. The lullabies, once fractured, were whole again, resilient, enduring, and reborn. But as the last note lingered in the air, A quiet question remained, one that would guide them all forward. Could these reclaimed songs truly heal all wounds? Or would the scars, visible and invisible, continue to remind them of the fragile balance between silence and truth? For now, Elara chose to believe in hope. The journey was far from over, but the silence had been broken, and in its place, a new story was beginning to unfold, a story shaped by courage, truth, and the unyielding power of song. As the children dispersed, their laughter mingling with the soft rustle of leaves, Elara lingered a moment longer, her eyes tracing the horizon where the sun met the earth. The lullabies had been reclaimed, not as veils, but as voices, echoes of survival that would carry them forward into whatever dawn awaited. And with that, she turned toward the future, ready to face whatever came next, knowing that the scars they bore were not the end, but the start of healing. The orphanage, once a place of shadows, now breathed with fragile light, a testament to the resilience of innocence and the enduring strength of truth. The lullabies were reborn,